Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
Today we are speaking with Anthony McCarten, who is an eclectic person because he is many things together. He is a writer, he was a journalist, and he's a writer of novels. He's a writer of plays. He's a writer of screenplays. He has been a director of movies. And now in London, there was a premiere not many days ago, and he has a play that is going on called The Collaboration at the Young Vic Theatre until April. And the actors are Paul Bettany and Jeremy Pope, right? Good afternoon, Anthony. Are you happy? Are you pleased with your play, with the collaboration? And is the play going to be only in London at the Young Vic, or do you intend to show it somewhere else?
Well, we had a crazy idea, or at least I had a crazy idea, that theatre would be an amazing place to start this project, and then we would then make it into a movie with the same actors. And this is not a disservice to the theatre because it was written as a play. So we're not treating the theatre as a workshop for the film, but it allowed us the potential to develop something for the stage, but then to use all the discoveries we made for the film as well, so the film would benefit from it. So it's a kind of new model, and this is the first experiment in this fashion. And so we will finish the show, we will then shoot the movie, and the plan is then to take...
Just an interruption, I forgot to say that the two actors interpret two very, very famous artists. One is Andy Warhol, the other one is Jean-Michel Basquiat, and in between them there is also a famous art dealer who's Bruno Bischofberger, right? So the play is about these two artists and how Bruno made them get together, right? Sorry.
Yeah, and you're quite right. And just to finish that thought, my thought was that we then would take the same actors for a third expression of this idea to Broadway and put it on later this year or early next year. So that is at least the plan. And yes, you are correct. It is about two artists. It's fundamentally a debate, a dialectic about what art is, what it should be, what its function is. And Andy and Jean-Michel represent kind of different philosophies about those questions. Andy is the older artist, he's established, but when we find him, his career is in decline, which is hard to imagine now that Andy Warhol's career was ever in decline, but by the mid-'80s, galleries were no longer taking his work and his prices were dropping. And Jean-Michel Basquiat, who started as a graffiti artist, at least he used city walls as his canvases, and then he graduated to canvases and then became picked up by the art scene and catapulted into fame so that by the age of 25, he was the hottest young emergent artist of his generation, at least in America. And he was the first major black painter that had emerged. So he was carrying a lot on his shoulders. So it's a debate really about what art is and what it should be and what it can do.
But it's also, if I'm not wrong, a dialogue between two men, right? Two persons, a young man and an old man. And Jean-Michel is trying to solicitate the old artist to go back to drawing, to go back to his painting, right? The other one is trying to convince Jean-Michel not to use drugs, but to concentrate on his work, right? I mean, there is like a mutual help. Of course, I have the impression that there is fighting, resistance between the two of them, and but at the end of the day, ends beautifully, right? With the two painting together.
In the end, art is their salvation. Yeah, this is the discovery they make at the end, and that there's no difference between them in that. Both of them need salvation, and both find it in the expression of their creativity.
Was it difficult for you to recreate this atmosphere of New York in the 70s and the spirit of the time, and, which is very much into the play.
I had a kind of historic tour guide, a friend of mine who lives in the Lower East Side. He's older than I am, and he knew Warhol. I don't think he knew Basquiat. But he, in a single day, took me between a Basquiat exhibition at the Brandt Gallery to across the Lower East Side where John used to live and where Andy used to work, across to the Whitney where there was a Warhol retrospective. And I really soaked up the atmosphere and was able to dream myself back into the mid-1980s. And it was as a result of that walk and that double exhibition that I had the beginnings of this play, and it gave me the courage to think I could recreate it.
Anthony, you are the screenwriter of very famous films like The Theory of Everything, Bohemian, Rhapsody, The Darkest Hour, The Two Popes. You had an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay for 2 movies, The Two Popes and The Theory of Everything. And I heard that you also have a project to do a new, I don't know if a play or movie or what, having as protagonists Warren Buffett and Bill Gates. Lately, it seems that you like to put together 2 characters, right? The 2 popes, for instance, very different men, very different popes. Then 2 artists, and soon 2 tycoons, 2 great business people, one of them at least who changed part of the world today. But let's start with the 2 popes, right? Is it something you now like to do, or is it by chance?
Well, there's something essential in all drama where it's a dispute. There is an argument and its contradiction. And the beauty of dialogue, where ideas are competing with each other, is that you are allowed to contradict yourself as a writer and put as much energy and conviction into the contradiction as to the original argument. This is a pleasurable thing to do because it obliges you to empathize with opinions not your own. And I have become increasingly interested in the idea of debate, of dispute. A Jewish friend of mine called it rabbinical. And at its essence is the idea that debate is absolutely vital in society. And if we somehow avoid it because we just want peace, then we don't make any progress and we become increasingly polarized. So I wrote a play about 2 popes who couldn't agree on very much, except that they both believed in God. But how you believe in God, they couldn't really agree on. And that led to this play and a realization that there was a sort of theme. There was worship of religion, and this play was kind of about the worship of art.
You mean the Warhol Basquiat play?
And so I then realized that there's actually a trilogy here, and there's a unity between all 3 works, with the Buffett Gates play as well, which is called Wednesday at Warren's, Friday at Bill's, which is worship of money. What should we do with money? If you are fortunate enough to have a great deal of it, what should you do with it? How should you dispense it? What are your duties?
These dialogues that you put together, right? The 2 popes, or the 2 artists, or the 2 great financial people. You invent the dialogue, you do some research.
I engage in well-researched speculation. So by this, I mean that I learn enough to create a plausible scenario that is based in history. I then honor the known points, but between the known points, there are vast wastes of nothingness. There is no record of what someone said to someone else on a certain day. And into this space, I think the artist is the best qualified to try and fill it. I've always thought that fiction is the great repository of the truth because we have a bigger palette of colors to play with. Biographers must not depart from just the known facts. And if we are to say that the known facts only ever account for 50% of the truth, how should we then fill the second 50%? And who should do it? And I think the imaginative empathy that artists possess qualify them better than anyone else. So that's essentially my rather presumptuous career has been increasingly based on trespassing into worlds that I had no direct experience.
You put yourself in
places where I do not belong, but I don't question myself. I'm like a burglar. I've stolen into other people's lives, and I try to work out the quality, the essential quality and the essential themes that underlie those lives. And hopefully I come up with something new and something fresh. If I fail, then it wasn't worth the enterprise. The whole endeavor was...
I think it was fun, and I believe that Pope Francis enjoyed it, maybe less Pope Benedict, but I don't even know if he watched it. When the two popes together, they watch television, right? And one is Argentinian and the other one is German, and they watch a football game between the two countries, right? Argentina against Germany. I think this was your invention.
Of course.
And why did you do this? Because football represents a very, very popular, very, very important issue in everybody's lives.
Well, Pope Francis is a huge football fan, and Pope Benedict is utterly disinterested in anything except classical music and God. I thought it was a very revealing creation to restage the famous football game between their two nations and have this newcomer to football sit there and watch the enthusiasm of his fellow Pope. So you can see my strategy emerging is that I do not limit myself just to the known facts, because I think there are other revelations that you can deliver for audiences about historical characters.
But this is fiction, right? It must be difficult to do fiction. Normally, you wrote novels and things like that. A literary character is an invented character, even if you inspire yourself to someone, right? But it can be a completely unknown person, and the literary character becomes known because you write about him. I mean, when Flaubert writes Madame Bovary, she is a simple woman, right? And makes Madame Bovary a universal character. Instead, you go into real characters who are very well known, and there are lots of biographies, essays, and photographs about these people, right? But you transform them into your character. It must be more difficult. You're not entirely free.
There are huge constraints that history imposes that you must adhere to, you must be respectful of. You cannot tell the story of Napoleon and have him win the Battle of Waterloo. This would be absurd. Who would want to watch such a thing? But you can create a scene on the eve of Battle of Waterloo that we do not know happened, but which tells us something about the state of mind of Napoleon that evening. And this is how I think that it's a delicate balance that must be struck. And I hope I find it. Some people accuse me of going too far. There's a scene in Darkest Hour that no one will let me forget, where Churchill goes into the underground, the London Underground, and talks to local people. And historians, from the moment I wrote the scene, have been outraged. Critics, even last week, years after the film, keep mentioning it in newspaper articles, that this one scene destroyed the film for them. It was absurd to have Churchill go into the underground. The point of the scene of the underground, they're not interested in. The emotion that you receive from the scene, the critics are not interested in. They cannot, however, get past the idea that I have him descend the steps into a public underground station. I will never agree to abide by those rules, because that would make me subordinate to biography. And I'm not a biographer. I'm an artist. And the artist needs a degree of freedom.
Let's talk about Andy Warhol and Jean-Michel Basquiat, or Pope Benedict and Pope Francis. You certainly have one of the two that you prefer.
I initially sympathized with Francis and could not at first dream myself into the world of Benedict. It was much harder for me to try and understand his impulses and then present them as powerfully or as naturally as I could present Francis's position. But the revelation of these projects are that once I'm able to crack the code of a character, I go in there and find the Benedict within myself. I find that the ultra-conservative has views that I can sympathize with, that I do think we have to uphold. And these little moments of self-revelation and self-discovery is one of the great byproducts of doing this kind of endeavor.
You are also helped by a great actor, which is Anthony Hopkins, right, playing the role.
Exactly, yeah. It was a great joy to work with. I am able to call him Tony. He became a friend and certainly one of the greatest living actors.
Another great actor is the one you work with for Churchill, right? You're used to great actors.
Yes, well, I've been very fortunate in working with some of the very best, and I've been overjoyed to see that the collaboration between us has resulted in 3 of them winning Academy Awards for Best Actors, and Tony Hopkins and Jonathan Pryce were both nominated, and Felicity Jones was nominated for Best Supporting Actress. So there seems to be something in my work that allows actors to do their best performances.
And you have a preference between Jean-Michel Basquiat and Andy Warhol? I mean, in the play, can we see that you self-indulge more in one of the two, or it's an equal game?
I felt more bound by history with Andy Warhol because more is known, and Basquiat was more of a challenge to write. But I think for me personally, more of a revelation about what I think Jean's process is and what his work is about. And the 2 great gambles dramatically in this play as a writer is to have speculated that Andy is afraid of painting because it opens up too much emotion and painful emotion. And he cannot afford that. He is not strong enough. And so he pushes it away. He pushes people away, keeps them at a distance, and he does art that doesn't require an enormous emotional investment. So that was the one gamble. The other gamble is the idea that Basquiat's work at its heart was spiritual and had ultimately a desire to save lives, a belief that art could save lives, and that it had this reincarnatory power to bring people back to life, either actually as a metaphor, but also even perhaps physically. I think he believed in the kind of supernatural powers of art. And they were the 2 ideas that are, I think, entirely original. They may be ideas that audiences reject, but for me, this is what I felt from my research of these men.
And tell me about Warren Buffett and Bill Gates. Did you meet them? Do you know them?
I met Bill. I met him at a party in the hills of Colorado at a film festival where we both had films. He had a documentary and I had a film, The Two Popes. And he was at the next table. And I drank 2 quick glasses of tequila to get the courage to go and sit down with him. And I announced that I had written both a play and a non-fiction book about him and Warren. And he moved from being very suspicious of me to almost embracing the idea of the project in about 5 minutes. And it showed me something about Bill, that Bill turns complex moments into opportunities very quickly. And I could see that something of his genius is in that capacity.
You like opposites, right? I mean, you like Francis and Benedict, who are really the opposite, or even Basquiat and Warhol, one super white man, pale, the other a black man, even physically, they are very different. But Warren and Bill, I mean, they have an age difference like Basquiat and Warhol. What do they have in common? I mean, Basquiat and Warhol, in a way or the other, they have in common art, right? But what makes similar Warren and Bill? Because Bill, after all, is an inventor, and then money was a consequence of his invention. Instead, Warren is a financier. I mean, he makes money. That's his job. But in order to make these 2 jobs, they might be both mathematicians or not. I don't know. What is the fil rouge between the 2 of them?
Well, when we find them in the play, they're number 1 and number 2 richest men in the world on the Forbes richest list. So they have wealth in common. Secondly, when they first met, Bill didn't want to meet Warren because he said, we won't have anything in common. I make things and he shuffles paper. He plays with stocks and so forth, but I create things. When they did meet, however, they found that they had a great deal in common. And what they had in common was that their brains, their very unusual brains, functioned in a similar fashion. They both had great analytical powers. They also had sort of far-seeing abilities, so they could project their fortunes into the future in a way that not all of us are capable of doing. And then there are stark differences between them. You've noted one of them, that one makes technology and one knows how to play the markets. But the other bigger difference that these two have is about what money should be used for. They have money entering into their bank accounts like fire hoses that cannot be turned off. And that creates very unusual problems that are unique to the very, very rich. And for Warren, he was not interested in doing much more than looking after his shareholders, i.e., making sure that those who are already wealthy became more wealthy. He thought his wife would take care of any philanthropy, any giving away of the money, but his duty in life was to increase the value of shares in his company, Berkshire Hathaway. Bill was starting, under the influence of his new wife, Melinda Gates, to consider another entirely new remit for the very, very rich, which is to responsibly give their money away so that the last check that they write bounces. This was such a radical idea when it was first presented to Warren that he couldn't imagine that. He would have thought it was a derogation of responsibility to his shareholders. But the journey from that distance that separated them in terms of what they should do with their great wealth to the moment where they come to realize that they will work together and create the biggest philanthropic organization the world has ever seen, that is the journey of the play. And it mirrors the journeys of the other two plays in the trilogy, that polar opposites, if they can find a middle ground through dispute, through this rabbinical style dispute, learn to listen to each other and come to some sort of middle ground, enormous benefits can accrue for them personally and everyone else who's associated with it.
When is this play going to be performed?
Next year. We're aiming to present it next year as the final part of the trilogy. I have a vague hope that someday in the future some ambitious theatre will stage all three of them on consecutive nights, and then you will see that there is a common sort of impulse.
You are a fiction writer. You wrote many books. Some of them were very successful, translated in several languages. And therefore you are, let's say, you are the only one. You, the writer, and then the novel, and then the readers, right? Instead, when you write a screenplay, it's you write the story, then there is the director and the actors, right? So It's a little bit different. But there are many novelists, but not so many great screenwriters. Why? Is it because it's very difficult to be a screenwriter, which is probably a modern way to be a playwright? Or
yeah, the first answer that comes to mind is that films are much more expensive to produce. And so that means a limited number of opportunities exist. I think at every Frankfurter Book Festival, which is the biggest book festival in the world, there's something like 30,000 new novels. It may be, the number could be wrong. It could be 200,000 new novels. It's relatively cheap to produce and press a small print run of a novel. And so that creates this very broad opportunity for creative people to express themselves with very little downside. For films to be successful and reach a wide audience, you need actors who are expensive. You need a story that is expansive enough to make people want to leave their homes and come and see it, cinematic. And you need budgets that range from single-digit millions to hundreds of millions. And so even if you're a good screenwriter, the chances of you getting all the resources and the money and the actors you need is very, very slim. So the great majority of screenplays that are written never see the light of day. And the screenwriters therefore never get to mature because they're just not able to do enough work and learn from it and then do the next one and do the next one. So they always stay as an apprentice.
what I feel is that they are not recognized enough in the sense that, look at the music, right? We all know about Irving Berlin, about Ennio Morricone. They're big characters, even if they're not the director or the actor, right? There would be no film without the writing, of the screenplay, which is like la colonne vertébrale of the movie, right? If your films and theater plays are completely based on dialogue between two people, more or less, the dialogue is very, very important, right? And the writer, look at some screenwriters like Fitzgerald or Faulkner, right? They are not well known because they did that. They are well known because they were writers, because of their novels. So don't you think that there should be more justice? I can tell you this because you do many other things. Shouldn't you be more well-known screenwriters?
The answer is obviously yes, but there's whoever said there was justice in the world anyway. And certainly in Hollywood terms, we live in the cult of the actor and to some extent the cult of the director. And there has never really been a cult of the writer in Hollywood, in the movies in general. William Faulkner, who you mentioned, he said the only way to stay sane in Hollywood was to do your work, take the check, and leave town. There's no point in hanging around waiting for anybody to respect you. And there is a complete ignorance almost on the part of the public when they watch a movie about who created the majority of this film, which is often, if it's an original story, is the writer. He or she imagines every character. They imagine every scenario. They tell the actor or actress to enter a scene. This is what they say. This is what they do. Leave the scene. Really, you could argue that the director is really only the second director and that the writer is the first director of every film. But the public are not interested in that. And you could count on one hand the number of screenwriters who are well-known or household names. So that is our destiny, but it's a glorious way to spend your life.
But you say our destiny, but your destiny is you are also a producer, and you have been a director, and you probably will be again, right?
Yeah, and my main impulse is not to seek the spotlight anyway. I am thrilled that I have a job that I can go to that is the creation of stories that are at present reaching a wide audience. There were many years when this was not the case. I've really only found the ability to reach a wide audience since the last 15 years, and I'm now 60. So between 25 and 45, they were very difficult years. I couldn't find an audience. I couldn't find a way in. What I did do is I never gave up hoping that I would find an audience. So although, I may not get the respect or that all writers live without, mainly, I'm so very grateful that I'm working at a high level now. And that eclipses any potential sort of disappointment that I don't have notoriety or fame. I mean, what is fame anyway? Isn't it just a tin can that is tied to your leg that you walk around with? It's kind of foolish.
Your wife, Eva, who is German, and you met in Munich in a bookstore, she loved you because you were a wandering poet, not because you are a famous screenwriter.
Exactly. She certainly does not require me to become more famous. In fact, she would prefer that I stay nicely anonymous.
After all these movies, the last movie of great importance was The Two Popes. You have new movies coming out that you wrote?
I do. I have one about Whitney Houston called I Want to Dance with Somebody, based on her hit song. It's the story of Whitney. I'm producing it with the Houston estate, with Clive Davis, the great music mogul, and Sony Pictures are distributing it this coming Christmas, globally. It's going to be, I hope, a very big deal, at least on the scale of Bohemian Rhapsody. So
this is again your eclecticism, right? You switch from popes to artists, bankers, to music rock stars. What do you like in this music rock star? The tragedy of their life, the fact that they from nothing go very, very up and then they fall into despair or things like that?
I think for me, my main interest in working on stories about musicians is that it allows you to incorporate in a very natural way, not like musicals where people just burst into song for no reason. You can have music naturally in the movie. And I'm very interested in the interplay between drama and music and what it does emotionally as a storyteller. And I'm getting better at using music in my stories and integrating them in very natural ways. And I think the highest expression of that I have yet achieved will be in this Whitney Houston movie, where I think the music really magnifies in a wonderful way the emotional moments that would have been fine without music, but are even much, much deeper and greater with the music. This is the main appeal.
Meaning of music is very important to philosophers like Schopenhauer, right? I mean, the importance of music.
The universal language, and not only the universal language of the heart.
This is your next project, all right? And there's nothing else that you prepare?
Yes, we have a Broadway musical that's starting in Boston in June and then coming into New York about Neil Diamond. And this is very close to my heart because I was one of 7 children and my mother's medicated by playing Neil Diamond records my entire childhood.
You were in New Zealand.
Yeah, a small city on the coast of the North Island of New Zealand on the side of a volcano. I got to meet Neil Diamond in New York. He has taught me how to play Sweet Caroline on the guitar, and it's another of the great joys of my life that I've been able to work on that project. So we hope this brings some of the genius of Neil Diamond to people in a way they haven't seen it before.
So, I mean, you spend your life confronted with all these big people, artists, musicians, politicians. So you must have a great life. And all this you do staying in your house in London, right?
Well, I have to go out of my great house in London to meet all these wonderful people. And maybe it's just because I was born in a small town and I had a great curiosity for what was happening over the horizon, quite sure that there was a party going on to which I had not been invited, that I've spent my professional life now trying to bust into other people's parties. And there
are 2 things that I noticed. First of all, you're Catholic. You were brought up Catholic. And I feel there is a deep religious stream in your life. And in the same time, you have a lot of fun in your work.
I always say I don't add comedy to my stories, but I don't leave it out, because any true representation of life has to have comedy in it, because life is heartbreaking, but it is also sometimes very funny. And humor is how we survive the great comedy that's life. So, yeah, I have a displaced religion running through my work. I stopped believing in the details of the religious dogma, but there's a line in the play where Andy Warhol, who was also Catholic, says, "I'm a disbeliever whose disbelief regularly fails." And I feel that in my life, that although I'm not particularly attuned to religious worship, there are moments that make me worshipful. When we are confronted and confounded by a moment of extraordinary beauty, the only word that seems to suffice is God.
What about the moment, the horrible moment that we are living now, watching what's going on in the world?
Well, the human race has proved itself unteachable again. It refuses to learn from its past mistakes. And yet we tend towards improvement and we tend towards enlightenment. And I think that the journey, in the end, will be worth the price of admission.
Thank you, Anthony McCarten, for this interview. We wish you all the best.
Thank you very much.
Alain Elkann interviews.